Before the sun sets on her 16th birthday, she shall prick her finger on the spindle of a spinning wheel and die.
Remember that time Disney bet their existence on a girl who sleeps through half her own movie? That was Sleeping Beauty.
It's just that you're
A stranger?
Mm-hmm.
But don't you remember? We've met before.
We have?
Well, of course.
The 1959 hand-painted masterpiece that cost $6 million to make. The most expensive animated film in history at that point, over $63 million in today's money. We're talking about a film that took 6 years to complete, required 300 artists working full-time, and generated exactly zero profit during its original theatrical run.
So the king and his queen watched with heavy hearts as their most precious possession, their only child, disappeared into the night.
Today we're counting down 15 weird facts you didn't know about Sleeping Beauty, from the casting disaster that almost derailed the entire production, to the medieval art style that confused audiences and the technological innovations that changed animation forever. Now before we dive in, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to Remember That Time for deep dives into the movies and shows we grew up on, and share this video with a friend who wore out their Sleeping Beauty VHS back in the day. Now let's get into it. Number 15. It took longer to make than World War II. Sleeping Beauty wasn't just a long production. It was an epic that consumed 6 years of Disney's life, from 1953 to 1959. To put that in perspective, the United States fought in World War II for 3 years and 8 months. Disney spent more time making a 75-minute cartoon than it took to defeat the Axis powers. Pre-production actually started even earlier, in 1951. Walt Disney announced the project publicly in 1953, the same year Queen Elizabeth II was crowned. By the time Sleeping Beauty finally hit theaters in January 1959, Eisenhower was president, Alaska and Hawaii had just become states, and Fidel Castro had just taken power in Cuba. The reason for the delay wasn't laziness, it was perfectionism bordering on obsession. Walt wanted every frame to look like a medieval tapestry come to life. That meant painstakingly detailed backgrounds inspired by 15th century illuminated manuscripts and pre-Raphaelite paintings. Animator Mark Davis later said they were essentially hand-painting a museum exhibition frame by frame, 24 frames per second. Number 14, Walt Disney hated the voice he chose for Aurora. Costa won the role of Princess Aurora after auditioning at a Hollywood party in 1952. She was a classically trained opera singer, which is exactly what Walt wanted. One small problem: he couldn't stand her speaking voice. Costa had a thick Southern accent. She was born in Tennessee, and every time she spoke as Aurora, Walt heard Knoxville instead of a fairy tale kingdom. So he made her go through intensive dialect coaching for months to erase any trace of the South from her performance.
Well, he's tall and handsome and so romantic.
But here's where it gets interesting. Walt loved her singing voice so much that he built the entire character around it. Aurora has less than 18 minutes of screen time in a 75-minute film, but she has more singing than dialogue. That wasn't an accident. That was Walt working around the voice he didn't want to hear. Costa later admitted the experience was brutal. She'd record lines, and Walt would sit in the booth shaking his head. Then she'd sing, and suddenly he'd be smiling. The message was pretty clear. Less talking, more singing, and it worked. Once Upon a Dream became one of Disney's most iconic musical moments, but it came at the cost of Aurora barely existing as a speaking character in her own movie. Number 13. The prince was supposed to be the main character. In early drafts of Sleeping Beauty, Prince Philip wasn't just a supporting character who shows up to kiss the princess. He was the star. The original story outline had Philip carrying most of the narrative, with Aurora serving as the prize he was fighting for. Walt Disney himself pushed for this. He wanted a strong male hero in the lead, someone audiences could root for during the action sequences. The fairy godmothers, Flora, Fauna, and Merryweather, were supposed to be minor comic relief. But as the story development dragged on, the writers realized they had a problem. Philip was boring. He had no personality beyond brave prince. Meanwhile, the three fairies were hilarious. Every story meeting, the fairy scenes got the biggest laughs. So the writers quietly shifted the focus. By the final script, the fairies had taken over the movie. They raise Aurora, they drive the plot, they argue about cake and dress colors, and they're the ones who ultimately save the day by freeing Philip and giving him the weapons to fight Maleficent. Philip still gets his hero moment, but he's essentially a weapon wielded by three middle-aged women in pointy hats. And honestly, the movie's better for it. Number 12, Maleficent was animated by a woman who based her on herself. Mark Davis, one of Disney's legendary 9 old men, designed and animated Maleficent. But the character's commanding presence and theatrical gestures came from an unexpected source: his wife, Alice Davis. Mark would bring his work home, and Alice, a costume designer and performer herself, would act out Maleficent scenes in their living room. She'd sweep her arms dramatically, tilt her head with regal disdain, and deliver lines like, "Now shall you deal with me, O Prince, and all the powers of hell," while Mark sketched furiously. Alice later said she channeled every terrifying authority figure from her childhood: stern school teachers, imperious relatives, and one particularly intimidating dance instructor. The result was a villain who moved like a Shakespearean actress commanding a stage. But here's the kicker. Maleficent's design was also inspired by another Hollywood icon, Joan Crawford. Mark Davis admitted he borrowed Crawford's severe cheekbones and dramatic eyebrows. Some animators even pinned up photos of Crawford from her late 1940s films as reference material. So Maleficent is essentially a fusion of Alice Davis's theatrical flair and Joan Crawford's bone structure. No wonder she's the most iconic Disney villain ever created. Number 11. Eleanor Audley voiced 2 Disney villains and never got credit on posters. Eleanor Audley provided the chilling voice for Maleficent, and she's the reason the character feels so genuinely threatening.
Cradle! Did you hear that, my pet? All these years, they've been looking for a baby.
Audley was a trained stage actress with a voice that could cut through steel. She'd previously voiced Lady Tremaine in Cinderella, making her the only actor to voice 2 of Disney's greatest villains. But despite being the voice of pure evil in 2 of Disney's most successful films, Audley's name never appeared on a movie poster or in major promotional materials. Voice actors in the 1950s were treated as behind-the-scenes technicians, not stars. The studio didn't want audiences thinking about the actors behind the characters. Audley also served as the live-action reference model for Maleficent's animation. Disney animators would film her performing scenes in full costume and makeup, then use that footage to capture her movements and expressions. It's called rotoscoping, and Audley's physicality is all over the final character. She wore a long black robe, carried a staff, and acted out every scene in a soundstage while cameras rolled. The animators then traced over her movements to create Maleficent's unsettling realism. Audley died in 1991, decades before Maleficent became a cultural phenomenon again through merchandise, theme park appearances, and eventually Angelina Jolie's live-action films. She never saw how massive her creation became. Number 10. Disney invented a new camera to make the movie. Sleeping Beauty was the first animated feature shot entirely in Super Technorama 70, an ultra-widescreen format that was supposed to make the film look more epic and compete with live-action spectacles like Ben-Hur. One problem, no camera existed that could shoot animation in that format. So Disney's engineers built one from scratch. They called it the Multiplane Camera 2.0, a massive piece of equipment that cost over $500,000 to construct. This thing was enormous, standing several stories tall and weighing multiple tons. It could hold up to 7 layers of painted cells and backgrounds, each on a separate plane, allowing for unprecedented depth and movement. The camera could also pan, tilt, and zoom in ways previous animation cameras couldn't. That's how they achieved those sweeping shots through the forest and the dramatic push-in on Maleficent's castle. But shooting in widescreen created another problem: more canvas to fill. Every background had to be wider, more detailed, and more expensive. A standard Disney background from the 1940s might take one artist a few days to complete. Sleeping Beauty's backgrounds took teams of artists weeks. Walt was convinced widescreen was the future and that audiences would demand it. He was right about the technology, but wrong about the timing. By 1959, the widescreen craze was already fading, and most theaters couldn't project Super Technorama 70 properly. Many audiences saw Sleeping Beauty in cropped or poorly formatted prints that chopped off parts of the image. Disney spent a fortune inventing a camera for a format that was already going out of style. Number 9, the fairies were almost cut entirely. Hard to imagine Sleeping Beauty without Flora, Fauna, and Merryweather, but early in development, Walt Disney considered eliminating them completely. The original Charles Perrault fairy tale doesn't feature 3 bumbling godmothers raising the princess in secret. It has 7 fairy godmothers who show up at the christening, give gifts, and then disappear from the story. In early Disney drafts, they followed that structure. But Walt had a problem. Without the fairies, the film had no comedic relief and no emotional center. Aurora sleeps through the climax, and Philip is too bland to carry the movie alone. Writer Erdman Penner suggested expanding the fairies' roles, making them Aurora's protectors and surrogate mothers. Initially, Walt resisted. He thought 3 old ladies arguing about cake and dress colors would undermine the epic tone he wanted. The writers kept pushing. They created the scene where the fairies attempt to bake a birthday cake and sew a dress without magic, and when they presented it in a story meeting, Walt finally laughed. That scene stayed in, and once it did, the fairies became the heart of the film. By the time animation started, Flora, Fauna, and Merryweather had more screen time than Aurora and Philip combined. The movie Walt wanted to make, a grand romantic epic, had accidentally become a comedy about 3 fairy godmothers trying to raise a teenager. Number 8. The film's failure nearly ended Disney animation. Sleeping Beauty premiered on January 29, 1959, and it was a catastrophe. Not critically, the reviews were mostly positive, financially. The film cost $6 million to produce, making it the most expensive animated film ever made at the time. It needed to earn at least $7.7 million just to break even after marketing and distribution costs. It earned $5.3 million domestically during its original run. Let me say that again. Disney's most ambitious animated film lost money. A lot of money. Walt Disney was devastated. He'd poured 6 years and millions of dollars into what he believed would be his animation studio's crowning achievement. Instead, it was a commercial flop that nearly bankrupted the company. The fallout was immediate and brutal. Walt shut down the animation department's feature film production. He laid off nearly 2/3 of his animation staff, keeping only a skeleton crew to work on short films and television projects. Disney didn't produce another fairy tale musical for 30 years. The next one was The Little Mermaid in 1989. That's how badly Sleeping Beauty's failure scarred the studio. What went wrong? Audiences in 1959 were losing interest in traditional fairy tales. They wanted contemporary stories, and they wanted them in live action. Sleeping Beauty felt old-fashioned the day it opened. It wasn't until the film's 1970 re-release that it finally turned a profit, more than a decade after its premiere. By then, a generation of kids who'd never seen it in theaters packed cinemas, and Sleeping Beauty began its slow transformation into a beloved classic. But in 1959, it was a disaster that almost killed Disney animation for good. Okay, so we're about halfway through this video, and I need to take a quick pause because I have to ask, what's your earliest memory of Sleeping Beauty? Was it the VHS cover with Maleficent's castle, Aurora spinning in the forest, or that terrifying dragon fight? Tell us in the comments section below. And while you're down there, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe, you silly goose, so you don't miss our next trip back to the stuff we grew up on. Now let's get back to the countdown with number 7. Number 7, Maleficent's dragon transformation was animated without rotoscoping. The climactic battle where Maleficent transforms into a dragon is one of the most technically impressive sequences Disney ever produced. And unlike most of the film, which used live-action reference footage, The dragon was animated entirely from imagination. Why? Because nobody at Disney had any idea what a dragon transforming from a human sorceress should look like in real life. Animator Wooly Reitherman, who directed the sequence, studied medieval illustrations of dragons, crocodile movements, and even batwing anatomy. He wanted the dragon to feel massive, ancient, and genuinely terrifying, not like a cartoon monster. The dragon sequence took over a year to animate. Every scale, every flame burst, every wing flap was hand-drawn. The animators used real fire footage as reference for the flames, filming controlled burns and then rotoscoping the fire elements onto the animation cells. But the dragon itself was pure artistic invention, and it paid off. That final battle is still considered one of the greatest action sequences in animation history. Number 6, the movie has less dialogue than almost any Disney film. Sleeping Beauty runs 75 minutes, but it contains only about 30 minutes of actual dialogue. The rest is music, action, or silent atmospheric sequences. Aurora herself speaks for less than 18 minutes of screen time. She's the title character, and she's barely in her own movie. She appears in exactly 2 major sequences, the forest scene where she meets Philip and the climax where she's asleep. Compare that to Snow White, who appears in nearly 40 minutes of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, or Cinderella, who dominates Cinderella's 74-minute runtime. This wasn't a creative choice Walt wanted, it was a consequence of the production's troubled development. The story went through so many rewrites that Aurora's character never solidified. She exists more as a symbol than a person, a beautiful object to be protected rather than an active participant in her own story. Critics in 1959 noticed. Several reviews pointed out that the princess sleeps through her own climax and has less personality than the furniture. Modern critics are even harsher. Aurora is frequently cited as the most passive Disney princess, someone who literally does nothing except exist beautifully and then fall asleep. But that emptiness is also why the film works visually. Aurora isn't a character. She's a moving painting, a collection of elegant lines and graceful movements designed to be admired, not understood. Number 5. Disney artists hated the angular art style. Sleeping Beauty's distinctive look, with its sharp lines, geometric backgrounds, and stylized character designs, was inspired by medieval tapestries and the work of illustrator Eyvind Earle. Walt hired Earle as the production designer and gave him unprecedented control over the film's visual style. That decision caused a near mutiny among Disney's veteran animators. The artists had spent decades perfecting the soft, rounded Disney house style. Characters like Snow White and Cinderella had gentle curves and realistic proportions. Earle wanted the opposite: angular, stylized, almost abstract. Mark Davis later admitted that many animators despised Earle's designs. They felt the backgrounds overwhelmed the characters, and that the style was too cold and unapproachable for a fairy tale romance. But Walt backed Earle completely. He wanted Sleeping Beauty to look different from every other Disney film, and he was willing to sacrifice warmth for grandeur. The result is a film that looks like no other Disney movie, before or since. It's stunning, but it's also alienating. Audiences in 1959 didn't know what to make of it. Number 4, the film was edited with different endings for different countries. The dragon battle was considered too intense for some international markets, so Disney created alternate versions of the climax. In several European countries, the sequence where Philip throws the sword and kills the dragon was shortened, and the dragon's death was obscured by additional smoke and fire effects. In Japan, an entirely different ending was considered where Maleficent's death is implied rather than shown. That version was ultimately rejected, but prints with reduced violence were distributed throughout Asia. The sword of truth, also caused issues. In some markets, religious groups objected to the fairies blessing a weapon and calling it holy. Disney had to remove or redub those lines in certain territories. These edits meant that for decades, depending on where you lived, you saw a slightly different version of Sleeping Beauty. The full, uncut version didn't become the global standard until home video releases in the 1980s. Number 3, Walt Disney never made another fairy tale musical. Sleeping Beauty's failure broke something in Walt. After 1959, he completely abandoned princess stories and fairy tale musicals. The rest of his career was devoted to live-action films like Mary Poppins, theme park expansion, and experimental projects like Epcot. He never greenlit another animated fairy tale. When Walt died in 1966, the animation department was a shadow of its former self. The studio released The Jungle Book in 1967, but it was already in production when Walt passed. After that, Disney Animation entered what's now called the Dark Age, a 20-year stretch of underperforming films that nearly killed the studio. It wasn't until 1989, 30 years after Sleeping Beauty, that Disney tried another fairy tale princess musical with The Little Mermaid. That film's success launched the Disney Renaissance, but Walt never lived to see it. Sleeping Beauty was supposed to be his masterpiece. Instead, it became the film that convinced him animation was a dead medium. Number 2, Maleficent's costume cost more than some entire films. Eleanor Audley's live-action costume for the rotoscoping sessions was a functioning medieval robe that cost $12,000 to create in $1957. Adjusted for inflation, that's over $130,000 today. The costume included hand-embroidered details, real metal clasps, and a weighted hem to create the dramatic swoosh when Audley moved. It was designed by costumer Chuck Keene, who treated it like a Broadway production costume rather than a behind-the-scenes reference outfit. Why spend so much on something the audience would never see in live action? Because Walt believed the authenticity would translate to the animation. If Audley felt like a powerful sorceress in the costume, that energy would come through in her performance and movements. He was right. Maleficent moves with a weight and presence that no other Disney villain has matched. You can feel the heaviness of her robes, the deliberate placement of every gesture. That $12,000 costume appears in exactly 0 seconds of live-action footage in the final film, but it's in every frame of Maleficent's animation. Number 1. The prince almost didn't have a name. Prince Philip is the first Disney prince to receive an actual name in the film itself. Before Sleeping Beauty, Disney princes were just the prince in Snow White and Cinderella, but Philip almost joined them in anonymity. Early scripts simply called him the prince, and Walt was fine with that. The character barely had any dialogue anyway, so why bother naming him? It was writer Erdman Penner who insisted the prince needed a name if he was going to have a personality. Penner pushed for Philip, naming him after Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, who had married Queen Elizabeth II in 1947. Walt initially rejected it, thinking it was too on the nose. But Penner argued that giving the character a real name, especially one associated with actual royalty, would make him feel more grounded and heroic. Walt eventually relented, and Prince Philip became the first named Disney prince. It would be 50 years before Disney gave us another prince with a proper name in the film itself, Prince Naveen in The Princess and the Frog. That small decision changed Disney storytelling forever. After Sleeping Beauty, princes were no longer interchangeable props. They were characters, and there you have it. 15 weird facts you didn't know about Sleeping Beauty. Which one shocked you the most? Was it the $6 million budget that nearly destroyed Disney, Eleanor Audley voicing 2 villains without credit, or the fact that Aurora barely speaks in her own movie? Hit like if this brought back some memories. Subscribe for more deep dives into the TV and movies that raised us. And share this video with a friend who can still sing Once Upon a Dream from memory. Until next time.